Alright, good afternoon po. I'm here in Luxembourg University para po ma-attend sa isang conference or presentation, seminar. So ayan, ang mga professor ng Luxembourg University. Hello, good afternoon po. Now I'm here in presentation po ng aking kaibigan. Presentation ng aking mga kaibigang professor dito sa Luxembourg University ngayong hapon po. Yeah, mag-i-start na po. Hello.
Streaming this or just recording it or both?
Yeah, I think it's recording.
Just recording, right?
Yeah.
You're not streaming?
No, it's just for the preparation. So,
Okay, good.
yeah.
Because I have a colleague in
Yeah.
Warsaw who's interested.
Oh yeah.
So it'll be
Oh.
Take maybe 1 or 2 weeks.
There.
Yes. They actually prepare it. I mean, they do it nicely. But then it's available on their YouTube channel, and we can send them
It'll be up on YouTube. All right, fine. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
It works well. We have
Yeah.
the previous ones, and we send it to the speakers, and they were really happy. I posted them on Facebook. Quite a few people like it. So
Cool.
I'm doing live now.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'll
Yeah.
let my friend know. Yeah.
So I want to show you the presentation. Hello, Aibo. Andito ako ngayon sa Luxembourg University for the presentation conference of my professors friends here in Luxembourg University. Mitete ne, do you want to see? Mitete kudasai ne. Ima sugoku konkai 2回目なんですけど、すっごい綺麗なところ、見たことないいろんなデパートメント行ったんですね。Department of Economics, Department of Mathematics, Department of Education and Science. So I think it's good to see. Good evening. Oh, it's good evening in Japan. Here is just 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So I'm very thankful for being a part of this seminar. So I enjoyed and I loved my adventure in Poland, Warsaw, Poland, and of course now I'm here in Luxembourg University. So I have a workout this morning. So
yeah. Okay.
now
Is it
they
too
are
loud now, or?
preparing. They're not still starting. Hello, Tita Ludi.
I think it's okay.
Good afternoon. I'm here in Luxembourg University as a guest of this university. It's okay.
It's okay.
It's okay. I'm doing.
Live.
This is only in Facebook. My friends wants to see it. Yeah. He is the organizer of this event here in Luxembourg University. So, andyan ang mga professor. Andyan, may makikita nyo to sa... Hello, Lucy Teroka. I'm here. Eraser. Gusto niyo ba ilibot ko kayo dito sa university? Mamaya, I took video some of parts of university campus. This is my second time. 2回目なんですけど、何回来てもすごく素敵ですね。ずっとコンチータプロフェッサーコンチータの部屋にいまして、それから一緒にイタリアンレストラン行きました。Professor, my best friend, Professor Conchita of Department of Science. mo lang from Tita Heidi Omiset. Hello, Lucy Teraoka. I'm here in University of Luxembourg. Pagpakasay ko ano ne, so to detara ne mo wifi na ako na chow no de. Nakanira to kaya may wifi arambis ka do. This is very nice auditorium of Luxembourg University. So they are both audience from professor of different department and of University of Luxembourg and also university student. So it's mixed. It's intercultural, so it's worldwide audience, professors and students. University of Luxembourg. So I'm happy, very happy to be a part of this conference or presentation of my friend. Sige, pakikinggan na mamaya. Mais muna natin to. So magkukwento lang po ako sa inyo. Magkukwento lang po ako sa inyo na from Narita Airport to Warsaw, Poland. It was 11 hours and 30 minutes direct flight. Then I waited 2 hours and a half at the airport for my connecting flight to Luxembourg, and it's only 1.5 hours by plane, and then from there, from the airport, it takes 20 minutes from the airport to my hotel, because my friend, the Conchita's resident house, is in Esch. It's a part of Luxembourg, but it's outside Luxembourg capital, so it's in the province Surbarg. So now from Esch station I took a bus to meet her in his office, because she's doing very busy for the preparation of this conference. So, ayan, marami-rami na pong dumating. Marami-rami na pong dumating, maybe around 50. And they are preparing there. Different professor. Hello, Isabelita St. Cosmo. Yeah. Kauwi mo lang. Hi, Bo. Otskare sama. Otskare sama de esta. Hello, ayan, suot kang kay Tita Lynn na earrings. Dito sa kauna-unahan para makita ko madinig ko ang presentation, because it's all about mathematics. And so ano pa po bang gusto nyo malaman about Luxembourg University? I like Luxembourg University because of the beautiful industrial zone and they preserve it, although they're not using it now anymore. And I visited the library, inside the library, because last year when I was here, I'd been here, it was closed. But now it's open because it still have class. Hello, Lucy Teraoka of I'm speechless now kasi andun yung focus ko sa mga visitors. So kailangan behave na po ako. At kaya sa mga bukas we're traveling again from Esch to going to the station of Luxembourg is just 20 minutes, and from there I'm going to Germany, Stuttgart and Froxheim. From there I will travel again to see the World Heritage. Hello, Andres Merchant. Thank you for watching. So baka maubusan po ako ng battery. I want to make sure that I can have battery. Do I look good in my outfit for conference?
Hello. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the 5th session of the last colloquium talk. And the speaker today is Walter Bossert from the University of Montreal. So I learned that Walter got his PhD from the University of Karlsruhe a few years ago. And since the beginning of this century, he is a professor at the University of Montreal. And his field of research is social choice, but seen from a mathematical point of view, and including, axiomatic aspects of social choice. So this should be a great subject for mathematicians and computer scientists like us here. And please, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to talk about some of my work here. Most of what I will be talking about today is based on joint work with my co-author and dear friend, Koru Suzumura, who is at Waseda University in Tokyo. And some of the projects that I'll touch upon are also co-authored with my colleague Yves Beaumont at the University of Montreal. Well, as you can see from the topic of my talk, I'll be talking about choice. And the analysis of choice problems is something that shows up all the time in economics, in economic theory, in political theory. I mean, you have consumers making choices of consumption bundles. You have firms choosing production plans subject to technology constraints, market strategies subject to legal constraints. Governments make choices of policies, how much healthcare, what kind of healthcare they provide, infrastructure projects, etc., etc. In fact, it's difficult to think about economic problems that do not involve some form of choice. Now, the way this links to mathematical techniques in this particular case is when we look at choice behavior, the standard traditional assumption in economics is people are assumed to behave what's often referred to as rational. They display rational behavior, and I use the term rational in a very general sense. When I talk about rational choice, what that basically means is purposive choice. That is, choice with an underlying purpose. And the way you can think of that or conceive that or formalize it is that choices are made in accordance with some underlying goodness relation. Just a binary relation that says, well, I make my choices so that I pick these the objects that, according to some criterion, I find the ones that are best among the ones that are available. Now, what is traditionally done in economics and in other disciplines as well is that we endow these relations, goodness relations or preference relations, with some properties. Well, these are just assumptions, such as transitivity. That's a very common one, of course. But on the other hand, especially if we're talking about group choices, or choices that are made on behalf of several individuals, transitivity can be a very demanding condition. And in fact, it's often considered too demanding because there are many notions of behavior, or there are many examples for behavioral patterns that may not conform to transitivity and yet can be considered quite rational in a milder sense, and in a sense that we think is quite plausible, and I'll get to the details of that, of course. The other assumption that is often made is that people are able to compare any two situations or any two objects that they may encounter, and again, that's something that in reality may not be the case. So we may very well allow for the possibility of non-comparability. Now, the main focus of my talk is a property, a weakening of transitivity that my co-author developed over 40 years ago, and it's been in my opinion, overlooked in the literature for far too long. And one of the reasons I want to talk about this is that I think it is really a very useful and promising concept that has applications that go well beyond the ones I will be talking about today. So what I want to do is I want to first introduce Koduro's contribution, basically, well, not the entire contribution, but the highlights, so to speak, his definition of a weakening of transitivity, just as a property of a binary relation. Talk a little bit about its mathematical properties, which I think are actually quite interesting and promising, and then talk about an application of this concept of this weakening in the context of rational choice. If I have time at the end, I may talk about collective choice as well. If not, actually, put on a little bibliography. It's very short, 10, 12 items that you can access on the MAST website, I believe. So if anything is, if there's anything that I'm not going to be able to talk about, you can still have a look if you're interested, which I hope you will be. So the basic setup is very standard. We have a set of objects, call it X. You assume it's not empty, because if the set of objects we're talking about is empty, there is not very much to be said about it. So that's not the most interesting situation. So this is just our set of objects. No further restrictions. It can be finite, it can be countably infinite, it can be continuum, it can be anything you like. So the theory of choice, of rational choice that I'm going to be talking about is very general. It's not restricted to a specific consumer choice problems or problems of a firm or a government or whatever you name it. It's completely general. As I mentioned before, what we will do is we will look at rationalizability in the sense of purposive choice. And in order to talk about this, we need a relation. So R will just be a binary relation defined on this set of objects. And let me mention from the outset, we do not assume that this is a linear ordering. We do not assume antisymmetry, and the simple reason is, especially with the applications we have in mind, it is perfectly possible that there are situations in which decision makers consider two options to be equally good. So a linear or antisymmetric ranking would be way too demanding for the applications that we have in mind. So we do not assume antisymmetry. What we do assume for part of the talk is completeness and transitivity. I'll define it in a moment. But again, I want to emphasize this is not a linear order. Well, associated with this relation, which we interpret as at least as good as, or a preference relation, if you will, are the corresponding asymmetric and symmetric parts. I'll denote them by P of R and I of R. So P of R is just a set of all pairs xy, such that xy is in this relation, that is x is at least as good as y, and yx is not in this relation. P for preferred, that's basically a notation that has developed over the years in economic applications. The symmetric part, or indifference part of the relation, is just a set of pairs that are well equally good. That is a set of pairs of xy, such that both xy and yx are in our relation. Standard properties that are imposed on relations of that nature are, as I mentioned, completeness and transitivity. I had a brief chat with Bruno earlier. The terms that are often used for some of these properties differ, not only across disciplines, but even within disciplines. So I'll just be very clear what I mean when I write down any property. By completeness, I simply mean that any two alternatives can be compared. Right? It has to be true that at least one of xy or yx is in our relation. So completeness for us means if you take any two alternatives, x and y, in our universal set X, it has to be the case that the pair xy is in our relation, or yx is in this relation, or both, of course. This is not the exclusive or evidently, as usual. The second standard property that's often thought of as the fundamental rationality property is transitivity. And as we all know, but I'll write it down anyway, transitivity simply means if x is at least as good as y and y is at least as good as z, then x is at least as good as z. Xy is in R and yz is in R, then xz has to be in R. One more notion that we will use repeatedly and frequently is the transitive closure of a relation. the transitive closure, it's a closure operation evidently, and it's the smallest transitive relation that contains a given relation. So the transitive closure TC of R of any relation is the set of all pairs xy such that I can find a chain of these relations from x, leading from x to y. So that there exists some k, it's just a natural number, length of the chain, and alternatives x0 to xk in our universal set such that we start at x0 and along our chain we link one element to the next one, right? Xk minus 1 xk is in R for all little k from 1 to k, and at the end of the day we arrive at y. And that's just one way of defining the very well-known notion of a transitive closure. And again, it can be shown it has all the properties of the closure operation. Clearly, the relation R itself is a subset of it, and this transitive closure is the unique, smallest transitive relation that contains R. All right, so far so good. Now, as I mentioned earlier, especially in economics, it's been quite traditional and quite common to always assume that preferences or goodness relations are complete and transitive. This is a very strong assumption, especially if you, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at decision problems that involve groups of people. It's sometimes difficult enough to assume, or a quite heroic assumption even for an individual, to assume that this person can make any comparisons of any two objects that you might put in front of them. Again, if you go one step further and apply this to groups of individuals, it becomes even more evident that this might be simply too demanding. Same is true for transitivity. Again, transitivity is intuitively plausible, but it is very strong. For that reason, weakenings of transitivity have been introduced. One example is what's called quasi-transitivity. And quasi-transitivity simply requires that the asymmetric part of the relation is transitive. This notion of weakening of transitivity has some interesting features. For example, it shows up as a condition that applies if you want to look at path-independent choices. If you would want to apply some divide and conquer method to make your choices, you start out with a feasible set that can be very complex and large, and you divide it into two subsets. You make a decision on these, and you keep moving. Of course, if this procedure is dependent on the path you choose, how you divide up each set in each stage into smaller sets, then you have a problem, and path independence can be linked to the property of quasi-transitivity. The second, weaker property, clearly, obviously this is a weakening of transitivity because it only applies to the asymmetric part. If you want to go even weaker, there is just the traditional property is acyclicity, which rules out the presence of strict cycles. So acyclicity says that if you pick any two elements in our set of objects, x and y, if xy is in the transitive closure, not of R, but of P of R, then it should not be the case that yx is in P of R, right? Basically what this does is it rules out strict cycles. You cannot have a situation where you move from a chain of strict preferences from x to y, and then you turn around at the end of the day and say, well, y is also strictly better than x. Clearly this is what we might want, something that we might want to consider a minimal requirement that we might want to impose on anything, if we want to have anything that might resemble plausible or in some wide sense rational behavior. Now, acyclicity also has played an important role in some of the literature. it can be used as a necessary and sufficient condition for finite sets that any subset of these finite sets has a non-empty set of maximal elements. Maximal elements are elements such that there exists no other element in the set that's strictly better. Right, so these properties do have some history, and they do have some merit, undoubtedly, but there are also problems with them. And one of them, which may not appear at first as something to be like a big deal, but in my opinion it is for many applications, is that there is no such thing as a closure operation for these properties, right? There is no such thing as a quasi-transitive, or acyclical closure, right? It's easy to see why this is the case, right? For example, take a set with 3 alternatives, 3 objects, and look at a relation with a cycle, right? What can you do about this? Well, we know a unique transitive closure exists, that's not a problem, but there's no such thing as a quasi-transitive or a cyclical closure, because in order to obtain an acyclical relation, all you need to do is add one of the reverse relations for any of the 3. So add any of yx, zy, or xz to get an acyclical relation. All the problems, you can add any of these, right? Any one of them will do, which means there's no such thing as a unique smallest acyclical relation that contains this relation. Same is true for quasi-transitivity. Add any 2 of these, and you end up with a quasi-transitive relation, but there's no unique way of doing it. Again, this may at first glance seem to just be curiosity, but it has implications or consequences that make these properties very hard to work with in the kinds of issues that we want to apply them to. Now, what I want to introduce now is an alternative weakening of transitivity that was introduced by Kodro or Suzumura under the name of consistency. A few years ago, I started calling it Suzumura consistency simply because the term consistency could mean many things, right? It's not very specific, so to distinguish it from others, I started calling it Suzumura consistency. I want to point out that this was not Kodro who came up with this name. He's way too modest for that. Well, actually, I think he shares this characteristic with most people who are truly brilliant. He's one of them. So, but in the end, he gradually agreed that I can call it Suzumura consistency. But it was not him who started. All right, what is Suzumura consistency? Well, it's a strengthening of acyclicity, where we rule out not only strict preference cycles, but any cycle with at least one instance of strict preference. So Suzumura consistency looks very similar to acyclicity, with one important difference. Instead of the transitive closure of the asymmetric part of R, we use the transitive closure of R itself. So if it so happens that xy is in the transitive closure of R, not of P of R, then yx should not be in P of R. Right, so when we rule out our cycles, but we rule out more cycles than what is done with acyclicity, we rule out cycles with at least one instance of strict preference. With at least one instance of where we apply the asymmetric part here. And the reason why we might want to rule that out is, fairly intuitive, because if your preferences are not Suzumura consistent, basically you are what's sometimes referred to as a money pump. In that case, assuming that transactions are costless, suppose you start out with an object, somebody offers you to exchange this for another object, and the second object is, according to your own preference, at least as good as the first. You can engage in that trade. You can do this k times. At the end of the day, this person can then offer back your initial alternative for you. If it's strictly better, you're willing to pay something for it. And you can repeat this as many times as you like. And clearly, if you're the object of such a racket, so to speak, you're not going to be a happy camper. So violations of Suzumura consistency are something that is very difficult to reconcile with any notion of sensible or sensitive or rational behavior. Right? In that sense, we consider it a quite minimal requirement. We don't want to go lower than that, so to speak. Coming back to quasi-transitivity and acyclicity, unlike those two properties, Suzumura consistency does have a well-defined closure operation. There is such a thing as a Suzumura consistent closure. Here it is. The Suzumura consistent closure of R contains, first of all the pairs in R itself. And what do we have to add? Well, we have to add pairs to make sure that such cycles cannot occur. So that means we have to add the pair xy to this relation whenever xy is in the transitive closure, and at the same time yx is already in R. Why is that? Well, if we don't add this pair xy, we're dead in the water because we immediately get a contradiction to Suzumura consistency. It turns out that this is also all you have to add to arrive at a Suzumura consistent relation. So this is a well-defined closure operation. It has all the properties of a closure operation, and unlike is the case with quasi-transitivity and acyclicity, this works. And of course, we get that R itself is contained in the Suzumura consistent closure of itself, which in turn is contained in the transitive closure of R. Notice that Suzumura consistency also is weaker than transitivity. It's clearly stronger than acyclicity. Suzumura consistency and quasi-transitivity are independent, right? They have nothing to do with each other. So in general, the implication is that transitivity implies quasi-transitivity, which in turn implies acyclicity. Transitivity also implies Suzumura consistency, which in turn implies acyclicity. But again, there's no relationship between quasi-transitivity and Suzumura consistency. And of course, you can always find examples to show that these relations can indeed be strict. Right? These subset relations can be strict. So clearly, it is not the same thing. There are circumstances where Suzumura consistency and transitivity are the same, and that's when the relation you start out with is complete. So in the presence of completeness, transitivity and Suzumura consistency are equivalent. Otherwise, Suzumura consistency is weaker. Now this existence of a closure operation is, first of all, we think a nice formal, a nice mathematical observation, but as we shall see when we move on, it's also of importance in many applications. Before I move on to the application, I want to mention one more result of Kodaros in his original paper. He showed that Suzumura consistency also has the interesting property of being necessary and sufficient for the existence of a complete and transitive extension of a relation. And some of you, or most of you, if not all of you, may know about a quite fundamental result by Edward Stilrein in 1930 on the existence of the extension of partial orders. Basically, what Koda did was he generalized this by showing that Suzumura consistency not only is sufficient or necessary, but necessary and sufficient for the existence of a complete and transitive extension. I could just write this out to be precise. So we say that a relation R prime is what we call an extension of a relation R. Well, if R is contained in R prime, and also the asymmetric part of R is contained in the asymmetric part of R prime. So R has to be contained in R prime, and the asymmetric part of R has to be contained in the asymmetric part of R prime. This is important Spielrein's original formulation of the result applied to anti-symmetric relations only. In that case, this was an issue. But of course, if you allow for indifference, if you allow for indifferences that go beyond identities, you have to make sure that this subset relationship is also satisfied, because otherwise the whole thing would be trivial, because you could just have the universal indifference relation. That's an extension of everything. All right, so what Edward Spielrein did is the following. He showed that if R is transitive, this implies that R has a complete intransitive extension. Remember, we didn't make any assumptions regarding the structure of our set X. So in general, the result like that will involve some non-constructive methods. No surprise there. Now what Kodor has shown is that if you weaken transitivity to Suzumura consistency, what you get is not only another sufficient condition, but a necessary and sufficient condition. So that was in a paper in 1976. So any relation R has a complete and transitive extension if and only if R is Suzumura consistent. And to me, I think this is a quite fundamental result. I mean, Spielrein is a classic, and I found it quite remarkable that Kodor came upon this quite substantial generalization and very clean characterization of the existence of a complete intransitive extension, basically along the way when he was working on an application in social choice theory. So much for the mathematical background. Again, two arguments that I want to reiterate here is that just simply from a purely aesthetical point of view, having a well-defined closure operation and having this necessary and sufficient condition for the complete intransitive extension are, to me at least, quite interesting properties. But I now want to move on to put this property to work, and show how it can be used in place of transitivity and completeness, for that matter, to come up with weaker notions of rationality that can be more accommodating, in the sense that observed behavior that you may have rejected as not said being up to the requirement of rationalizability now become rationalizable, but the cost associated with that is not too high, simply because you're still within reason in the sense that you don't allow for preferences that get you into cycles or other unpleasantnesses. And again, the example I want to start out with and focus on here is just a very standard general choice problem. And the choice problem just says you can observe choices that the decision maker makes from sets of feasible objects, and the question is, can we reconcile this with our traditional assumption that people behave rationally in the sense that they have a purpose, that they have an underlying binary relation that they want to pick the best elements of. So in order to do this, we need the definition of what we call a choice function. First of all, I use script x to denote the power set of x, excluding the empty set, and the power set of x will be our set of potential feasible sets that a decision maker may encounter. Right? For example, if you think of a choice problem for a consumer, x could be the universal set of all possible consumption bundles, but in a given choice situation, feasible sets are more restrictive because we have to take into account the budget restriction of a decision maker. So this is the universal set from which all these objects can be drawn, but in any specific choice situations, we typically encounter some subset of it. But we will be completely general in terms of what kinds of subsets may occur as a feasible set for a decision maker. So now a choice function. Is a function C that has a domain sigma, which I'll say more about in a moment, which maps into this set of possible subsets, excluding the empty set. We don't allow for empty choices because empty choices are difficult to interpret. In some contributions you see the empty set showing up as a possible choice, but we have difficulties with interpreting it. And if the result depends on the possibility of not choosing anything at all, that always makes us a little suspicious. Of course, what we do require is that you can only choose stuff that's actually feasible. So C of S has to be a subset of S. Now this domain sigma is completely general. It's not empty, because again, if we don't have any observations, there is not much to talk about. And of course, it itself is a subset of script X. So this is the most general definition of a choice problem that you can dream up, in the sense that the set of feasible options, the feasible sets that can appear in a choice problem is completely general. It could be any subset of the universal set. We don't restrict ourselves to consumer choice problems or anything of that nature. This is as general as it gets. Right? Just as you have a feasible set, you pick something from it, one or more objects, and given these observations for a domain of these feasible sets, the question then of rationality or rationalizability as well, can we reconcile this with the selection of some of the best elements according to some binary relation? So we say that the choice function C is rationalizable if there is a relation on our universal set X such that what we choose from S is the set of all objects in S that are in this relation are for any object in the feasible set Y. If that's true for all feasible sets that we may encounter, say that this choice function is rationalizable. It is purposive in the sense that the purpose here is to pick best elements according to this underlying relation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in many approaches you see this as an assumption. People assume preferences or goodness relations to be given and then say, let's start from there. But in a very real and pragmatic sense, choice is more fundamental than preference, because that's what we can observe, right? Typically, if you go out there and want to analyze the behavior of a decision maker, what you can observe is their actions, what they do, what they choose, right? And then basically you have to go backwards to ask yourself, is this behavior reconcilable with the traditional theories that are proposed in this context? So in a way, if you look at rationalizability, or as it was called in the context of consumer choice problems, revealed preference, what you're doing is you're going from choices to preferences, if these preferences exist. Right? That's the fundamental question. Right? Now, there's one observation that was made very early on by Paul Samuelson in the 30s that says, well, one thing is for sure, if we have these observations, choices from feasible sets, you end up observing that an object is chosen while another one is feasible. Well, this characteristic, this observation, has to be preserved by any rationalizing relation. If you don't preserve even that, you don't have a chance of getting a rationalization. To be precise, what is called the direct revealed preference relation is a relation that you can derive from a choice function. You don't need any other information about that. This is not a relation that may underlie the choice behavior. This is something that can be straightforwardly defined from the choice function itself. Let's call it R sub C to indicate the choice function, where it comes from. So take any two objects, x and y. X, y is in this direct reveal preference relation, according to our choice function C, if we can find a feasible set for which x is chosen and y is feasible. So if we can find a feasible set S in our domain sigma, such that x is chosen and y is feasible, we say that x is directly revealed preferred to y. Right? And again, the terminology already gives it away. That's exactly what it means. Right? You have an observation, x is chosen, y is feasible. You reveal that x has to be at least as good as y, if there is to be such a thing as a rationalization. And in the context of consumer choice problems, again, Samuelson realized this already in the 30s. And look, if you want to have anything like rational choice, you have to satisfy this. Of course, he did it in a more restricted environment where the set X was endowed with a lot more structure. It was just a subset of Rn, or Rn plus, the set of all possible consumption bundles. But the fundamental insight was already there. So this observation, let me just write it down. Let's call it a lemma, because I'll refer to it later so that I can give it a name. If there is a relation R that rationalizes the choice function C, then it has to be the case that the direct real preference relation is contained in R. There's no getting around it. And the proof of this is a one-liner, right? Half a line actually, right? So suppose that X and Y is in the direct reveal preference relation. By definition, this means that there exists a feasible set S such that X is chosen and Y is feasible, but that already means directly by definition of a rationalization that X has to be at least as good as Y according to the rationalization, and that's it. It's, if you write it out, it's very, very simple. And that's, but in a way it is an important insight because it tells us something. It's the first step towards a characterization of rational behavior. And in fact, such a characterization in full generality was provided by Marcel Richter in a 1971 paper. He says, well, basically, if we write down an axiom that is based on this observation, you get that this condition is necessary and sufficient for rational choice. This property is what we refer to as direct revelation coherence. And direct revelation coherence basically says, pick any feasible set S, pick any object X in this feasible set. If it is the case that xy is in the direct real preference relation for this choice function C, for all y in S, then it has to be the case that X is chosen. Right? So notice this is a condition imposed on the choice function only. Remember, this relation is determined once you have the choice function. We're not sneaking in the rationalization here by vector or anything. So this is a condition defined on the choice function. And what Richter has shown, and again this is very simple to prove, it's true, you can prove it by very elementary methods, is that this condition is necessary and sufficient for rational choice. This is Richter in 1971. C is rationalizable if and only if C satisfies direct revelation coherence. DRC for short. Again, proof of that is very, very elementary. doesn't require anything complex, any complex methods, and it's really literally based on this very simple observation that rationality means you have to respect the real preference relation, whether you like it or not. Right? Without that, no can do. Now, rationality by itself is something that, so it's good to know, of course. And again, this is completely general, no restrictions on the structure of the feasible set. But typically, we'd like a little more. And initially, this a little more was completeness and transitivity, right? So if you move from rationalizability per se to rationalizability by a transitive relation, you can get something that's actually very similar. You can probably already guess it. Because if you want something to be a transitive rationalization of a choice function, what you have to respect is not only the direct real preference relation, but its transitive closure. Right, so this is a second observation. Yeah, let's call it a lemma. Let's use it again later. If a relation rationalizes a choice function C, then not only the direct real preference relation, but the entire transitive closure of the direct real preference relation has to be respected. Which means it has to be contained in R. And again, proof is very simple. Suppose that xy is in the transitive closure of RC, which means that we can find the K and K plus 1 objects in our feasible set such that we can form a chain from X to Y. X is X naught, that's the beginning of the chain. Xk minus 1 xk is in our relation for all k. And at the end of the chain, we arrive at y. Well, this is RC, of course. This is our whole hypothesis, right? By lemma 1, we know that each of these instances of direct real preference have to be respected. We have rationalizability, right? So that means for all these little k's, xk minus 1 xk has to be not only in RC but in R. That's what lemma 1 says, right? Well, if we have this chain, we know, because we assume R to be transitive, that xy, which is nothing but the start and end point of this chain, has to be in R and we're done, right? This step follows from lemma 1, which follows from rationalizability. This step follows from the assumption that the rationalization is transitive. And again, the next step is kind of predictable. If you now want to characterize transitive rationalizability, you just replace the direct real preference relation in this condition with its transitive closure. Then we get what we call transitive closure, coherence, and transitive closure coherence, well, strengthens direct revelation coherence by replacing this instance of direct real preference by its transitive closure. So pick any feasible set, pick any element of the feasible set. If xy is in the transitive closure of the direct real preference relation for all feasible objects, then X has to be chosen. And the result now is again a characterization of transitive rationalizability by means of this transitive closure coherence property. Actually, I'm going to give you two results. Both of them proven by Marcel Richter, 66 and 71. C is rationalizable by a transitive relation if and only if C satisfies transitive closure coherence. And the second part is the more interesting one. It turns out that if you want to add completeness to transitivity, you don't have to do anything else. This property is enough even if you want the rationalization to be complete. So this is also equivalent to saying that C is rationalizable by a complete and transitive. And that you cannot do with elementary methods anymore, but what comes into play here is our good old friend Spielrein, because Richter used the extension theorem, Spielrein's extension theorem, to go from here to here. So you get essentially, because of the extension theorem, of the presence of the extension result, you get completeness for free, so to speak. Of course, Richter still had some work to do, because you have to make sure that the way he proved it, any extension, remember you cannot construct this as the existence of these extensions is proven by means of non-constructive methods. So what the Richter had to make sure is that if you pick any of these possible extensions, they continue to have the property of rationalizing the underlying choice. All right? So this second part is much more subtle than the first. The first is, which is very elementary methods, just like the one for straight rationalizability, but the second part where you throw in completeness is a little more subtle. But again, I want to reiterate that all of this is done on a completely general domain, right? No restrictions on the domain of the choice functions, no restriction on the nature or the structure of the universal set. Now, you see, at this stage, why quasi-transitivity and acyclicity are not such attractive properties anymore. I mean, it's generally understood completeness and transitivity are very demanding conditions, especially in group choices. If you want to allow for behavior that's not fully transitive or rational, or complete, what do? Well, weakening transitivity to quasi-transitivity can be done, but this very intuitive notion of having a relation that has to be respected as a minimum requirement is gone, right? Because there is no quasi-transitive or acyclical closure. You cannot use this kind of approach. You can still characterize rationalizability by a quasi-transitive or an acyclical relation, but it becomes very messy and much less intuitive, right? Basically, you have to work with, somewhere, existential clauses will have to come into the formulation of the necessary and sufficient conditions. Existential clauses by themselves are not really a problem, but sometimes they can become very close to the actual question of existence of the rationalized relation itself. So things are not clear-cut and neat at all if you want to do this kind of exercise with quasi-transitivity or acyclicity. With Suzumura consistency, on the other hand, we have a well-defined closure operation, and it turns out that it works just as well as transitivity, right? So if we say we want to relax the quite stringent requirements imposed by completeness and transitivity, and we use Suzumura consistency, which widens our possibilities of recognizing something as plausible notion of rational choice, we're back in business, because we can do exactly the same thing that we did for the transitive closure with the Suzumura consistent closure. So let me write this down as final lemma 3. If a relation R rationalizes C, what did I do here? And R is transitive. You're all fired. Nobody noticed. I mean, aren't you paying attention? All right. If R rationalizes C and R is Suzumura consistent, then again we have to have this subset relationship, right? No getting around it. But in this case, it's the Suzuma consistent closure of the direct revealed preference relation that has to be respected. And again, it's easy to see why this is the case. If xy is in the Suzuma consistent closure of RC, we know what that means. By definition of the Suzuma consistent closure, that means either xy is in RC to begin with, or we have to add xy to avoid a violation of Suzuma consistency, which means that xy is in the transitive closure of RC and yx is in RC. Right? That's just the definition of the Suzuma consistent closure. In that case, we're done at lemma 1, because we know we have to respect the direct revealed preference relation no matter what. In this case, we know that we can find our chain xk minus 1 xk is in RC. I'll let you fill in the blanks here. I don't want to repeat the same thing all over again. And likewise, yx is in RC. We know for each one of them, of these instances, by lemma 1 again, that xk minus 1 xk has to be in R all the way along the chain, which means x naught is in the transitive closure of R. We know by lemma 1 that yx is in R. So we have a xy is in R, yx is in R. Well, if xy is not in R, this preference is strict and we have a violation of Suzuma consistency. Therefore, xy had better be in R. So it's the same pattern as in the previous two results. And finally, in this setting, we can come up with a necessary and sufficient condition for rationalizability by a Suzuma consistent relation. We call it Suzuma consistent closure coherence. And of course, what it requires is that if we pick any feasible set S, and any element of this set S, if xy is in the Suzuma consistent closure of RC for all feasible objects y, then it must be the case that x is chosen in S. Okay, completely parallel with the case of transitivity, and the characterization result is also parallel for the Suzuma consistent part. And this is something Kodro, Eve, and I did in a 2005 paper. And that's the characterization of Suzuma consistent rationality. C is rationalizable by a Suzuma consistent relation. If and only if C satisfies Suzuma consistent closure coherence. Now we don't have a second part. We can't add completeness now. Why is that? Well, If you add completeness, you don't have a sufficient condition anymore, because in the case of completeness, Suzuma consistency is equivalent to transitivity, and we're back to this result. Right? There is no parallel to the second result, simply because it's not a different property anymore. Jean-Marc is getting out. That means I should get ready to be silent. And actually, that's it. That's essentially all I wanted to say, except to point out that this is barely scratching the surface. There are many other problems that show up in economic theory, political theory, where it might be useful to look into alternatives to transitivity and completeness. We've done something like that for choices under uncertainty, where we can extend the expected utility criterion, thereby avoiding many of the so-called paradoxes that show up. So don't knock expected utility just yet, because you may still be able to get a lot out of it if you're willing to give up completeness and transitivity and yet retain Suzuma consistency. We've looked into collective decision making, and it turns out that if we give up completeness of the social relation and weaken transitivity to Suzuma consistency, depending on the relation between the number of voters and the number of alternatives, we can actually go beyond the unanimity criterion by quite some margin if we are willing to perform this weakening again, moving from transitivity to Suzuma consistency. And we have also looked into decision criteria under uncertainty that are not probabilistic, that are set-based, for example. But let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for this beautiful introduction to this very complex and interesting subject. So do you have any questions about this talk? Yes? No?
I have what I think is an important comment about the connection with logic. It's not just an observation. I see here an opportunity for future research, and I'll explain it. In the 1980s, there was research into non-monotonic reasoning, which is human, let's call it human rational reasoning, which seems to have many applications also in the area which you work in. The thing is, the connection that I see all the time that you were talking, I was thinking about the connection. If the sets S of feasible, think of them as somebody has a logic in his head, and that the set X of states is possible states that he wants, then the sets S correspond to formulas of the logic that hold, that what he wants holds in it. So you get formulas of a non-monotonic logic corresponding to the sets S, which you want to find the relation R to rationalize. Okay? You see now, on the one hand, in the non-monotonic reasoning, you have conditions on a consequence relation. And I wrote a paper in the 1980. I said the minimal conditions is if from A of the set S, I will also, it's feasible, S1 and S2, and I take together S and S1, S2 is still feasible relative to that. And then, so that was my axioms, 1980s. And Kraus-Lehmann-Magidor gave it semantics using states, which are the S's, and put conditions on the S's that every point has a minimal point underneath it. They called it smooth, and they proved completeness. And then there was a lot of research about selection functions and logical conditions corresponding to the selection function. It's not just ordinary similarity. You are doing work on the possible semantics for the logic. So if I had your papers in front of me right now, then by the next 2 days I'll start working on it and see how the connection is. But it's a strong connection for research. And of course, in our group here, we work on this. We work on this connection. Okay?
Please do send me your work.
The other way around. The flow of energy goes from me to you at the moment. Because I know this and I know the logic. I just want to fit it. Okay? But we do both. I'll
Excellent.
And you,
Of course.
it's a whole of literature.
I'd be happy to.
Okay? I must say I'm very excited. I'm not going to sleep tonight. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you for this comment. Yes?
Just to continue what Bob said, so what I did, I adapted results from, Amartya Sen and like Hanson. So the representation result that you mentioned in your talk, when you you relate the properties of the betterness relation on your set of items and the property of the choice function.
Yeah.
So there are we call them representation result. I don't remember how they are called exactly in superstructure theory. And so I adapted them in a logic setting. I thought it was very good. Because the property of your choice function, in fact, they mirror actions used in logic. They are exactly the same. And that was very funny. Like, arrows property, sense property, gamma, and alpha. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you for those very interesting remarks. Are there any other questions or remarks about this talk? Otherwise, I propose that we continue the discussion while having a wine glass. Glass is sorry. Yes, a wine glass of wine. Thanks again for the talk.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So I can see it in YouTube. You can see it in YouTube. You can see it in the video. Yeah, YouTube. Yeah. Japan, go to stop it in Japan. Thank you. Ayan, tapos na po ang presentation ng aking kaibigan. So there are some professors from different universities. And he is the organizer, my friend. Both of them are also mathematician and economics professor. Hello, Ate Olive, Tita Sally, Maria of Montreal, Kazunori Harada, Yamana-Kasang, Tita Mayo Claveria of Montreal. Thank you for watching. Nagkaroon ng conference ang ating mga kaibigang professor. Resto Bar Kamayan, thank you. Sato Riveres, thank you so much for watching, for being with me. This is Antonio and Pascal Asione. Grazie mille, Runa, Nishi-san, Andres Marchand, and Elizabeth Seikoshu, Lucy Teraoka, Oy Aibo, Lucy Teraoka, Dong Wusong, Ken Ito, Saraban, Ludi, Tita Ludi, Villanueva. I'll see you in Los Angeles, California soon with Ate Christine and Kuya Rick. Aibo, thank you and good night to all of you. I think it's very late evening there. Tapos na po ang
So it's video drawn.
masaya at successful na
That's just my
successful presentation.
I've been starting to involve Bossert there. It's an hour. But I'll write to you. And well, actually, there are a lot of references are available.
Tita Ludi, thank you.
Thank you. See you soon in Los Angeles.
Oh, okay, then I'll yeah.
Just email them.
Yeah, I'll email it. Yeah.
The connection I was thinking about was rather about Polish logic about how does it work. Logic for coalition logic, you know?
Yeah, I know. There are lots of connections. I mean, when I was at KCL, I worked with this, and this guy, this, editor of one of my journals.
I know him very well. Chris is he's a lot of work
I
on
also
judgment
have
and
connections to voting, and I have some papers between voting and revision theories. There's only one vote. Okay, good.
But you still have I mean, I'm a bit electronically challenged at the moment because my laptop was on the way. I dropped it.
Okay, but I'm sorry. I didn't
Just in the reading list. There's a few, there's some more recent stuff that
So I'll see you.
We'll be in touch.
Over there.
Are you still connected to the camera?
She's gone.
Thank you.